Hello, I'm John Lewis with the Association of Clinical Research Organizations. Today I'm joined by Michael Reilly, Executive Director of the Alliance for Safe Biologic Medicines. Thank you, Michael.
Thanks, John.
So tell me about the Alliance for Safe Biologic Medicines.
The Alliance for Safe Biologic Medicines is an organization that's primarily comprised of patients groups, innovative medical technology companies, primarily on the pharmaceutical side, and physicians groups. We were formed in December of 2010 after the FDA was given the authority to establish a pathway for biosimilars in the Affordable Care Act.
Now, tell me about biosimilars and where the development status is in the U.S. and elsewhere.
Well, the U.S. does not yet have a pathway set up for biosimilars. That was the authority that I referenced a minute ago in the Affordable Care Act. The Europeans were the first to bring biosimilars to patients. They were granted the authority to approve them in 2003, and the first biosimilar was approved in 2006. They currently have 14 biosimilars in the EU. In addition to that, Canada followed Europe, and they now have 3 biosimilars approved. And the U.S. is really modeling after what the Europeans have done, and to some extent the Canadians, in terms of setting up a pathway that is very science-based and focused on patient safety.
And why are biosimilars treated differently than, say, generic drugs?
I think that this is a lot of the confusion that we're seeing right now with regards to people's understanding of biosimilars. They're organisms more so than chemical composition prescription drugs that people think of. And so biosimilars are an attempt to replicate a biologic, a living organism. But as the name implies, biosimilar, they are similar to, but not exactly the same as, the biologic that they're attempting to copy. And that's very different from a generic drug, which is really an exact replica of the underlying chemical composition.
So, for instance, for approval purposes and for patient safety purposes, we may see more clinical trials for biosimilars than we would for a generic drug.
Yeah, I mean, I think really that's one of the main differences between generic drugs and biosimilars, and the attempts to copy a biologic versus the attempt to copy something that is made in the laboratory, a chemical drug. And that is that we know that because of the fact they're made from living organisms, that even a slight change in the manufacturing process can have a significant change on the way a biologic works with a patient. And so we absolutely expect and have seen in Europe that there is a far greater need for clinical trials and data that can basically over time show that in any given patient, a particular biosimilar, the copy of a biologic, will react the same.
What are some of the other issues you're encountering with biosimilars?
I mean, the 2 big issues right now, one is really something that the FDA is grappling with, and that is what's the naming mechanism, whether we need a unique name. Our organization did a survey last summer, last August and September, in which we asked over 370 physicians 2 really primary questions. One is, what are your thoughts on the need to be aware of a substitution when it occurs with a biosimilar, meaning when a biologic is switched for a biosimilar. And the other really was, how do you think of the medicines you use in general? What's the way in which you identify the product that you're using on a given patient? And we did a paper that said basically we believe very strongly that unique names are needed, and that paper came out through the Food and Drug Law Institute late last fall. And so we very strongly support that concept. And then around substitution, this has really been a hot button issue in the states right now, because a number of states, 17 states in all, introduced legislation this year that basically allows for substitution of biosimilars, but most of the legislation calls for physicians to be notified if a substitution occurs. And many of those states, the legislation has either been defeated or basically held up until next year.
So let me just understand this from a patient perspective. I'm a patient and I'm currently taking a biologic drug, right, and I go to my pharmacy to fill the prescription, and the pharmacist, instead of the biologic that I was prescribed, substitutes a biosimilar, as is done commonly with generic drugs.
Right.
So the issue is whether my doctor should be notified.
Right.
And why would there be opposition to that?
Well, I mean, that's an interesting question, and I think we are quite surprised that there has been as much opposition to it. I think with regards to the issue overall, we think that looking at the EU model, the way they've done things in Europe, is in recognition of the threat of immunogenicity, of a reaction that occurs as a result of a switch. Basically, the Europeans do not allow for automatic substitution. So notification of a physician is really an issue because the physician is the decider, and that's the way it's done in Europe. We think that's the way it should be done. In addition to that, the other thing that the Europeans have acknowledged is that if you don't have physicians have a degree of comfort with these medicines, they're not going to prescribe them in the first place. And so they've really worked to educate their physicians and to really develop a comfort level with biosimilars. And instead of basically switching patients who are on biologics to biosimilars, they've promoted the idea of starting new patients on biosimilars. So they can get to the same goal, which is getting more patients using them, but they do it without the threat of immunogenicity, which is really a result of a switch, not of beginning on a biologic or a biosimilar in the first place.
And when do you think we might have some final guidance from the FDA on this issue?
I think that, I mean, the guidance they came out with last year was basically sufficient to kind of outline the pathway forward for manufacturers. But clearly there's a need around some of these hot button issues, like the naming issue. How are they going to do that? I actually would point out that there was a meeting on the 15th of April that concluded on the 17th of April, which was for the WHO to look at the issue of naming and to figure out whether unique names are needed. I think that will have some impact on what the FDA does. And so they're kind of looking around to what's happening in other jurisdictions. With regards to interchangeability, the FDA has said that if it's an interchangeable biosimilar, and that's something we haven't touched on yet, but interchangeable biosimilars are different than a biosimilar in that they are at a higher threshold of approval. They require more clinical trials. And essentially, according to the FDA, if a biosimilar is approved as an interchangeable, it can be automatically substituted without going back to the prescribing physician. However, it's important to note that the FDA said that if it's approved as a biosimilar, interchangeable biosimilar, it is eligible for automatic substitution, which means the states still decide. And that, I think, is a lot of the confusion right now, because we have been talking to legislators, and what we're hearing from legislators is they are kind of waiting for the FDA to do something because they're told that this preempts the FDA. But in our opinion, this does not preempt the FDA. The FDA will probably come out with more guidance, but enough has come out to give manufacturers a guiding post to getting approvals.
So do we currently have any biosimilars in the pipeline in the United States?
I don't believe there's any applications sitting with the FDA as of now, and they recently came out with guidance that basically was a signal to the manufacturers that you need to come in and meet with us. And that was really the purpose of the guidance that just came out in March. And it is essentially to say that until we start having dialogue and establishing and answering questions, you can only do so much of that through either formal or informal guidance. It really requires face-to-face meetings with the FDA. And we think the FDA has been very prudent about how they've approached biosimilars, because they're looking at the program over the long run and not looking at kind of a rush to get biosimilars out and thereby sacrificing, the long-term viability of the program.
Anything else you'd like to add?
I think just in general that, we're very confident about the pathway forward for biosimilars, and we as an organization, the Alliance for Safe Biologic Medicines, are extremely supportive. We're surprised, as I said, with regards to the notification, because it is important to note that on the issue of substitution, the notification that we have supported in legislation is after the substitution has already occurred. We've heard that this could possibly impact the ability of substitution. We don't think that, since the condition precedent to notification is that the substitution has already occurred, we think that it's impossible to impact it. And basically, if we don't get doctors comfortable, they're going to default to dispense as written as a way of avoiding a substitution all in all. And the result thereby will be a slower take-up rate for biosimilars in the U.S.
And how would I find out more information about the Alliance?
If you want to find out more information about the Alliance, go on www.safebiologics.org.
If you'd like to know more about ACRO, you may visit acrohealth.org or follow us on Twitter @ACROHealth. Thank you.